Everyone experiences ups and downs. It's no different for the best boxers in the world, navigating through a career in which everything can change overnight. Of course, that means we definitely love an inspiring comeback story in this sport, and the fights that cement those stories. Here are our picks for the top 10 greatest comeback fights in boxing. Number 10. Vitali Klitschko versus St. Peter. The Klitschko brothers absolutely ruled the European boxing circuit of the late 90s and early 2000s. It was quite the time to be a boxing fan, especially if you were Ukrainian or German. By the end of 2004, Vitali Klitschko had already amassed an impressive professional record. The WBC heavyweight champion was 35-2, with 34 KOs. His only 2 losses came when he was unable to continue due to a shoulder injury, in a fight he was dominating against Chris Bird, and by TKO, due to cuts against the legendary Lennox Lewis that Klitschko had been winning until that point. After pounding Danny Williams and winning by TKO in December 2004, Klitschko retired, citing a variety of physical ailments. He achieved quite a lot by then, and he was 33 years old. So even though his fans weren't happy, it wasn't seen as out of the ordinary for him to retire. Yet he came back swinging 4 years later, in 2008 to fight Samuel Peter in their second matchup. He was 37 and definitely a bit too old to be fighting like that in his weight class, despite what GGG would say. He brutalized Sam Peter and forced him to concede a TKO win to the man. Owing to his sheer size and strength, Klitschko went on to fight another 5 years, comping a 10-0 record with 7 KOs. Number 9. Erik Morales versus Jose Alfaro. Hailing from Mexico, Erik Morales was among the best pound-for-pound fighters throughout the 90s and 2000s. His name may not be heard around here too much, but don't let that fool you, because he fought some of boxing's greatest, including Manny Pacquiao, who he beat in a stunning victory in 2005. That was the peak of his career. Other than that, his trilogy with Marco Antonio Barrera is known as one of the best and most entertaining ever. But after beating Manny Pacquiao in 2005, Morales' career came off track. He lost to Zahir Rahim in 2005 and was then stopped by Pacquiao in 2 fateful rematches that saw him take a serious beating. With Zahir Rahim and Manny Pacquiao, that stood for 3 back-to-back losses. After then losing a very close fight to David Diaz in 2007, Morales decided to hang up his gloves. A 3-year hiatus followed, citing a need to rest and give his body time to properly heal. He began stating that he would return in interviews from 2009, and return he did. Flying out of retirement as a light welterweight, he pummeled Jose Alfaro on the 27th of March 2010 to mark a triumphant comeback before retiring for good in 2012. Number 8. Larry Holmes versus Ray Mercer. As a heavyweight champion, Larry Holmes stood among the greats in the late 80s to the 90s, alongside the likes of Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield. A well-loved technical puncher, he first had his mind set on beating Rocky Marciano's 49-0 undefeated fight record. However, this was undone by a bitterly disputed decision loss to Michael Spinks, further losses in a rematch with Spinks, and then by an exceedingly brutal KO by Mike Tyson, sent Holmes into retirement. But it didn't send the fighting spirit out of Holmes. Inspired by George Foreman's return to the ring, he began planning his own. He started by fighting frequently against moderate opposition, but he scored a sizable upset in '92, beating the fast-rising Ray Mercer in a shock victory that set him up to face Evander Holyfield later. The fight against Ray Mercer was an entertaining slugfest, as Holmes continually kept him at a distance and pummeled him with hard hooks and uppercuts. Mercer was simply unable to follow up with hits to damage the formidable Holmes, who had regained all his confidence. While it was a stunning victory by itself, Holmes never did regain his championship belt, and he retired for good later on in 2002. Number 7. James Braddock versus Griffin. Braddock was boxing during the height of the Great Depression, an altogether different time for boxing as a whole. Braddock was forced to give up boxing in 1933 as it simply wasn't making him enough money to pay the bills during that time of extreme crisis. But it wasn't the first time he dropped out. Despite starting his career very strongly, he entered into a time of irregularity as he got into the habit of taking risky fights for the money. Of course, he lost many of those fights, and with each loss, his earning potential decreased, a vicious cycle that only ended when he broke his right hand in a bout. He simply had no choice but to stop. This hand still caused him complications after many years. A year later, despite being officially retired, Braddock was offered a lucrative, late-notice bout against Griffin. No one expected him to be able to do much, but he completely shocked Griffin with the third-round stoppage. From then on, there was no looking back, as Cinderella Man, named such for his excellent footwork, went on to score victory after victory to eventually take the championship belt away from Max Bayer in 1935. It was one of the biggest championship upsets in history. Number 6. Frank Bruno versus Oliver McCall. Another one of the heavyweight greats of the late 80s to the 90s, Frank Bruno would be giving way to Lennox Lewis as Britain's best heavyweight superstar. He faced Mike Tyson at his peak in 1989, which not only brought a decisive end to Bruno's second world title attempt, but also detached the retina in his right eye. It was even worse than what Canelo inflicted on Billy Joe Saunders, and everyone wrote him off as a boxer. Nevertheless, his retina was surgically repaired and he was cleared to fight on, first making a comeback in 1991. However, this run would end at the hands of none other than Lennox Lewis, rather violently. He was put out of action once more. With 3 failed title shots, people were sure that this time, Frank Bruno had to retire. He responded by proving everyone wrong, and he scored a shocking unanimous decision victory over Oliver McCall. As admirable as his sheer tenacity was, he would unfortunately face a resurgent Mike Tyson, who would yet again send him into retirement, this time permanently. Number 5. Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder 1. After previously establishing himself as the United Kingdom's premier heavyweight boxer, following his defeat of John McDermott, Tyson Fury was set to fight his childhood hero. That fight came in 2015, when he outscored long-standing champion Vladimir Klitschko in a big upset. But what looked like the start of a new era foundered as Fury sank into a mental health crisis. He simply lost the motivation to carry forward after conquering his hero. His mental health issues made him unable to cope with the newfound fame and scrutiny, and he relinquished his titles and descended into vice, binging on drugs, alcohol, and junk food. He let his weight balloon to almost 400 pounds. Not only was he becoming dangerously unhealthy, but he also battled with thoughts of suicide. The boxing world sighed a collective sigh of relief as Tyson Fury suddenly announced his return in 2018. After almost 3 years of total hell, his first fight with Deontay Wilder in 2018 would mark the beginning of one of the greatest comeback stories in boxing history, even though that fight ended in a draw. He left no doubt in the inevitable rematches, defeating Deontay Wilder twice, and is still the reigning champion as of October 2013. Number 4. Evander Holyfield versus Mercer. Evander Holyfield is still regarded to be one of the most tenacious, brave, and dominant fighters ever. He was making a steady streak of victories, but it all came crashing down when he was diagnosed with a heart problem in '94 and medically disqualified from competition. It was even said he suffered a cardiac arrest in the midst of his title-losing fight with Michael Moorer that year. Under such circumstances, it didn't necessarily take any critical thinking to be convinced that Holyfield was done. Famously seeking the help of a Christian healer, Holyfield launched a comeback 15 months after his health scare, beating none other than Mercer, who was also beaten by Larry Holmes in his own comeback match. This was followed by 2 famous victories over Mike Tyson, before continuing to fight intermittently all the way until the late 2000s, dealing with multiple injury restrictions. Number 3. George Foreman versus Evander Holyfield. The legendary George Foreman needs no introduction. Famous for slugging out against Muhammad Ali, in the 1970s culminating in the extraordinary Rumble in the Jungle match, he had already established himself as one of the best heavyweight boxers. What made him step away from the ring was a brutal defeat at the hands of Jimmy Young in 1977. A full decade elapsed between the defeat to Jimmy Young that made him step away from the ring. So when he announced his return in 1987 looking visibly aged, overweight, and bald, people had low hopes. And then he would go on to score 24 consecutive victories over a 4-year span. This was before he managed to line up a challenge to Evander Holyfield that, again, most people had low hopes for. Yet again, Foreman would dash those low hopes into dust as he was competitive in a distance fight against a man 12 years his junior. Echoing something Gennady Golovkin would say many years later, he would prove that age isn't as big of a factor as you normally think. The ultimate shocker came when Foreman actually defeated Michael Moorer in 1994 to become the oldest heavyweight champion in boxing history. We may never see anything like it ever again, Number 2. Muhammad Ali versus Oscar Bonavena. 1967 saw the beginning of the first real roadblock in Muhammad Ali's career, as he famously refused to be drafted into fighting in the United States' involvement to sustain the Republic of Vietnam against the Communist People's Republic of Vietnam. Despite classifying himself as a conscientious objector, who famously declared that no Vietnamese ever called me a nigger. They didn't lynch me. They didn't set dogs on me. He was later found guilty in criminal court of violating selective service laws. Very few within the United States supported him in his decision as a Black American follower of Islam to reject wartime military duty, and his belts were stripped of him. He went 3 years without fighting, as the legal trouble from the decision followed him everywhere. That only made his triumphant return in 1970 after the resolution of all legal troubles all the more legendary. He promptly pummeled Oscar Bonavena to remind everyone why he was the greatest of all time. This second reign ran for 10 defenses across 3.5 years, involving some of the division's leading fighters and famously including the likes of George Foreman, a trilogy bout with Frazier, the Thriller in Manila, the latter of which is held by many as the greatest boxing match of them all. The legend would finally retire in 1981, after having a by then unprecedented 3 heavyweight title wins. Number 1. Mike Tyson versus Peter McNeely. Mike Tyson was the undisputed king of the mid to late 1980s, and every fighter that faced him left the ring terrified and broken due to his fast finishes and brutal knockout blows. But that didn't mean life didn't get to him once, or twice, or even several times. When Tyson returned in 1995, he looked back to his best, certainly in terms of his intimidation factor and fast finishes of serious challengers. Donovan Ruddock was his last opponent before he went to prison on highly controversial and contested rape charges. Nevertheless, enormous fanfare greeted his return to action in 1995, following a 3-year prison sentence. Before meeting the British force of nature Frank Bruno in the ring, he would come face-to-face with poor Peter McNeely. Needless to say, McNeely didn't stand a chance. It was the same match in which Tyson famously oscillated with dead-set eyes from left to right. What commenced was the deadliest beating McNeely took in his entire life, being knocked down multiple times and shaking hard. What finished it was a powerful right hook, but it was nice to see the two men remaining amicable and having a hug afterwards. Nevertheless, Mike Tyson was back to strike fear into the hearts of all that faced him. Do you agree with our list? Leave us a like and subscribe if you agree, or let us know in the comments if you think the ranking's off. We'll see you again when the dust settles on the canvas.